Hi everyone, so today we are moving into Module 11 where we are focusing on social justice and cultural issues in counseling and rehabilitation counseling. So I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with cultural implications related to counseling and the counseling profession. We've done a good amount, I think, up to this point in exploring the historical context behind treatment of people with disabilities, and that would extend to women with disabilities, which we're going to focus a little bit more on today, and individuals from marginalized populations as well that also do have disabilities. So I got some articles that I would like for you to review and read. Not going to go into a great bit of detail within the lecture today about multicultural issues in counseling, because if you have not looked ahead, you will be taking a full course on cultural issues in counseling. And so we try to integrate cultural issues in each course as well, so you'll get a lot of it. What I do think we need to do is focus on social justice issues specifically pertaining to women, because these are topics that aren't necessarily covered in other courses, and I think are very important for you to be knowledgeable of and aware of, because they're a little bit unique. So when you guys are going through and looking at the articles, the one thing that I will say is that that the articles can be a little bit tough to read. I'll say that with this week. As nice as it would be to think that acts of abuse, that ableism that leads to discriminatory practices, that leads to hate crimes, is not present as we move into the year 2020. These things are very much so present, not only in our society, but around the world, around the globe. Historically, individuals with disabilities have been marginalized to the greatest extent. Attempts have been made to just completely abolish certain classes of individuals with disabilities from our populations that have failed, thankfully. And so it can be an uncomfortable topic to talk about when we think about the treatment of individuals with disabilities, and even more so the current treatment of individuals with disabilities. So I guess that's my, my disclaimer to the entire module is that there are images that you might see within some of the videos, specifically within the Talking About Disability video with Celeste Adams. There are a lot of different historical images of individuals with disabilities being mistreated in a number of different ways, but so just mentally prepare yourself for that. The other thing that we're going to be talking about again is the women with disabilities piece of it, and part of that is sexuality. Yes, people with disabilities have sex. Shocking, I know. And our clients will want to have sex, or are having sex, or having problems with that. And so you have to be comfortable talking about these things. You just have to be. So why not just kind of dig into it right now as we are towards the end of the semester, right? So when we're getting into the lecture part of it and thinking about social justice is a construct that really counseling has done a very poor job at conceptualizing and operationalizing for our counselors. So what does that mean? That means that we have this term social justice, and not a lot of people know what to do about it. Not a lot of people know what it is. And when we ask people what social justice means to them, we get a lot of different answers back. So what I want to do is just differentiate social justice from multiculturalism and multicultural counseling, because they are, in my opinion, this is kind of reflective in a lot of different things, including literature, they are different constructs. And so social justice counseling has been kind of deemed the fifth force of counseling, the fourth force being multicultural counseling. So if we're thinking about multicultural counseling, it's pretty clear what we're talking about there. We're talking about looking at the cultural differences that exist in the populations that we're working with, being aware of how that impacts the counseling relationship, and making sure that we are respecting our clients' cultural belief systems. Social justice to me, broadens it a bit in that we're not specifically talking just about different cultures or ethnicities, but we are expanding that idea to include disability status, to include gender, to include sexual orientation, to include gender identity, if we're taking it to that degree as well, to include age and differences in age and ageism. And so if we're thinking about social justice in the broadest way, we are looking at all of the populations of individuals that have historically been oppressed, marginalized, and we are making sure that we're aware of societal inequities, of the impact of environments on the well-being of our clients. And so we're kind of expanding our understanding of worldviews as wide as it could potentially go. So with that, I provided just kind of some general definitions of social justice. What I do want to know, I mean, and reflect on this within the discussion post, what does social justice mean to you? For some people, it does mean that it is, working with a client in a very dedicated way to ensure that they are learning self-advocacy skills, and then that they are promoting themselves in a workplace, or really examining societal structures around them. It may be that you are an activist, that you feel like that you can advocate for a specific group or population. So it's can be a whole spectrum of things, social justice can be. But when we are working with clients, what we're really trying to do is, one, examine the oppression, the systemic oppression, marginalization, to all the isms, right? Racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, all the other biases, right? So we're working to understand the effects of oppression, marginalization. We are working to explore what that means in our worldview, in our lives, how it's impacted us, as well as how it's impacted our clients. And then we're working to change that. And the change part of it is just as important as the rest of it. So again, kind of going back to worldview, the construction of our worldview starts in childhood. I mean, our worldview begins to be constructed before we even know how to talk. If you have children, you're helping to construct their worldview. You've been doing that since the moment they were put on this planet. And so what this looks like in kind of real terms is kind of the gender norms that we see, racial inequities, social class, all of that comes through because of somebody's worldview. In worldviews in general, dominant cultural values are emphasized. So here in Western culture, the dominant culture is kind of that Anglo-Saxon white Christian culture, right? Middle class white America, that's kind of the dominant cultural values that have extended for 100, 200 years. 200 plus years, I suppose, at this point in America. So the lack of awareness around our privileged status tends to lead to a failure to really understand what our clients have experienced. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in this class is at a privileged status. I'm not implying that at all. I think that we all have a certain level of privilege once we acquire certain things in our life. For one, that would be a master's degree for you guys. And so by the nature of the work that you're doing and the education that you've received, innately you've got a bit of a privilege there. And so what can be important as you move forward is just to be very open in acknowledging the status, the privileged status that you have. I can address all my privileges to the nth degree, and I call my husband out on it all the time, and I look at my daughter straight in the eye and say, you are a very privileged individual. You should be thankful for what you have. And she's not even 4 yet. So, yeah, I mean, yes, you have to acknowledge that, because we have to be able to acknowledge our worldview and our status before we can really get into feeling comfortable discussing these issues with our clients. What we find is that there's often inconsistencies between knowledge and behavior. So it may be one thing for me to know a lot about a culture. It may be one thing for me to know a lot about people with disabilities. but the behavior that I express can be a completely different thing. We could sit down and teach people day after day after day about how individuals with disabilities should be treated, how our clients should be treated, how people with mental health impairment should be treated in a number of different environments. They can take a test and score 100 on it, but they could still go out the next day and discriminate against somebody. So there are those inconsistencies. What we have to do, again, is to reflect always on our values, beliefs, and biases about specific clients. A lot of this comes through supervision. When you get into practicum and internship, it'll be supervision by your site supervisor and your clinical supervisor, your faculty member that's supervising you. When you get out into the real world, when you're accruing hours, let's say for LPC, you'll still be seeking supervision, and ideally your supervisor is calling out some of these things, or at least bringing them up for discussion, because we all do have our own values. We all do have our belief systems and our biases, whether or not they're overt or covert biases, implicit biases or not. Remember from that lovely discussion board everybody was very happy with early on in the semester. But when the issues start to arise is when we are so steadfast in our personal values and belief systems that we can't see through that curtain to have an understanding of the different values and belief systems that our clients bring to us as part of their worldview in a counseling relationship, in the therapeutic relationship. And what happens is that when we can't see past our values and our beliefs to work ethically and effectively with our clients, then it will directly impact the therapeutic alliance. Our clients won't trust us. They won't be able to talk to us about certain things. They may be withholding information because they feel a certain way about us. And so it can really have a serious negative impact on the overall success of our clients meeting the goals that they had hoped to meet with us. So when we start to reflect on our values and our beliefs, where they came from, why we have them, why they've changed over time, and I think that's important to remember too, that you could have grown up in a very conservative, very restrictive family, and now you are the complete opposite of that. So it's important to reflect on why that changed, what happened in your life, what occurred. Were you provided with more education? Were you provided with actual life experiences that changed your mindset? What happened to get you to where you are right now in your value and belief systems? So once you reflect on this, then you can start to examine your behavior and be very self-critical about that. What type of verbal communication are we giving off? What's the inner dialogue that we're having with ourselves? What assumptions might we be making about our clients that don't share the same value or belief systems? It would be, discriminatory, quite honestly, if we were to limit our clientele to a certain population that shared the same values and beliefs as we did, right? So we can't do that, but we have to maintain ethical practices. We have to be able to see clients that have different opinions from us, and not let those differences seep into our responses to our clients. Moving kind of through and thinking about rehab counseling, it's our job as rehab counselor educators to inform you, to provide the knowledge base on, the history of rehab counseling, the historical treatment of people with disabilities, the clients you may be seeing in mental health and counseling as well. For us to be talking about, addressing worldview issues, barriers to counseling relationships and things of that nature. But one thing that is difficult for us to do is kind of teach social justice, right? So it can be a little bit tricky, again, from an educator's perspective, but what I hope to do is at the very least kind of open up the door to the idea of what social justice could look like for you guys. And one thing that was taught to me a long time ago was that even if I did not feel like I was providing clients with social justice informed counseling and treatment, at the end of the day, the information that I would provide my clients with would help promote empowerment, would help promote independence, and would oftentimes be teaching a client how to self-advocate, and so all of that does play into kind of the role of a social justice counselor. So I guess my main takeaway would be open to the idea of social justice in general, not just as advocacy, but in the greater picture. So when we're thinking about culture and providing culturally appropriate treatment, so there's notes that I would encourage you to look at, especially for exam purposes, that talk about very briefly about different ways to provide counseling, or different things to consider when you're providing counseling to somebody that's from a cultural background that may be different from yours. But kind of the main takeaways are that, remember, in any therapist-client relationship, there are power differentials that are inherently there, that we have to recognize as the counselor, because we are the ones that have to keep ourselves in check. Remember that assessments are normed on the dominant culture typically. So we've seen in more recent years that revisions of assessments have taken culture into consideration, but we have to be very aware of this if we're working with somebody from a different background from ours, that certain assessments just may not be appropriate. From a disability perspective, when we're looking at different assessments that we might be giving or providing to a client, it's always incredibly important to be aware of accessibility issues. And so if it's a form that needs to be completed, if somebody is not able to use a pen to write, or they use some type of technology, we may have to modify assessments or provide them in an alternative format in order to get any kind of information from our clients. You always have to be aware of ethical codes, because I don't think I should have to say why at this point, you guys know, but ethical codes do talk about cultural issues, being multiculturally competent, being able to understand the impacts of societal differences on specific cultures. We have to be able to understand our clients' worldview. And how do we do that? We ask. We ask about our clients' lives. We ask about the things that we don't know about or don't understand. We can learn a lot from our clients, just like I learn a lot from you guys as my students. But we have to ask. We have to put it out there. If we don't know something, we have to ask. And we have to continue to build competence in these areas as well. So moving on to women with disabilities. Really kind of not a sharp left turn there, but moving on, moving forward, I should say. Women with disabilities, kind of statistically, there are a good number of women living out there in the United States of America with disabilities, about 1 in 5 women. A lot of negative things, right? So women with disabilities are less educated. They're not provided with the same level of education. We see larger numbers of unemployment, lots more poverty, and paid less, which we all know that women in general are not making as much as men. So considering women with disabilities are even more so marginalized, then the pay is even less than what women without disabilities would be getting. A lot of the counseling literature that's out there actually supports women with disabilities as an actual cultural group. And so that's one thing to think about when we're thinking about disability and culture, is that some groups of individuals do consider themselves to be a cultural group and do meet the definition of what a cultural group would be. The deaf culture being that primary group that I'm thinking of, but women with disabilities being another kind of a cultural group that we could be looking at. There's a lot of different challenges for women with disabilities. There are long-standing assumptions, even within the rehab counseling and mental health counseling world, about working with women with disabilities that we should be aware of, and we have to be challenging our own belief systems again. So when we're thinking about employment, specifically employment inequities, there are the external inequities, the environmental inequities, and the internal or personal inequities. External being how people view women in the workplace in general, how people view more specifically women with disabilities in the workplace, and oftentimes it may be that somebody is not viewing somebody with a disability in the workplace, let alone a woman with a disability in the workplace. When it comes to training and education, women with disabilities may not be provided with the same level or the same opportunities or even be considered for additional training or education that would help them move up the career ladder. Lots of different social stereotypes and VR services. Literature has even shown that VR services provided to women with disabilities tend to be skewed, meaning that the same services are not being provided to women with disabilities that are being provided to men with disabilities, and really for no other reason than it's a woman rather than a man. Individuals with disabilities and women with disabilities certainly have kind of these ingrained, innate belief systems around their skills, their abilities to do things, their need to take care of a family, but then also an inability to take care of a family in the way that society feels that women should be able to take care of a family. And there might be a lack of disability self-awareness, what somebody can or cannot do. When it comes to counselor competence in this area and working with women with disabilities, we have to, one, examine our personal view of women in general, and then how we might view women being a client, and then even deeper into it, how we might view women with a disability as being a client seeking services for either employment purposes, kind of the more traditional rehab counseling route, or for mental health services as well. Gender bias, sex role stereotyping are present in rehabilitation services, including transition. So transition being moving from school-aged individuals, students with disabilities, youth with disabilities, and transitioning into the world of work, as well as in clinical mental health services. Basically, what does this mean is that we, as a group, as a cultural group in general, Americans, view women as, after all of these years, we still have these biases that are deeply ingrained in our society, where we feel that, not me personally, necessarily you guys, we as kind of the general broad term, feel that women should be in those traditional roles. Teachers, nurses, dental hygienists, working in hospitality areas, working as a receptionist. Not that there is anything wrong with these things, but whenever we are working with a client who's a woman who has a disability, it's important that we not project these biases and these sexual stereotypes onto our clients, which effectively limit their ability and may limit their potential, even what they feel is their potential. Lots of different healthcare inequities. Again, these are the bad stats, right, when we're thinking about women with disabilities. Women with disabilities are more likely to have secondary conditions, much higher rates of depression than men with disabilities, especially when we're talking about women with disabilities that live in rural areas. So that's going to include West Virginia, right? So when it comes to counseling women with disabilities, one thing that I'm going to talk about here in a couple minutes too, but one thing that we need to be considerate of is that if somebody's physical health is not in a state where they can focus on their mental health, we may have to link women with disabilities who are our clients up to services that can help them maintain or improve their physical health. So when we're thinking about just those annual exams, general physicals, checkups, things that kind of fall by the wayside anyway, and maybe that our client who's a woman with a disability may not have received these services, and therefore could be at a higher risk of getting like cervical cancer down the road. And there may be reasons why, this goes back to the social justice issues, there may be reasons why the woman has not been able to get those services. It could be something like the doctor's office is not accessible. An exam table was not something they could get up on. A doctor refused to see them because they had never worked with somebody who was somebody that used a wheelchair, and they didn't know how to perform an annual exam on somebody that didn't have functioning of their lower extremities. So there are lots of different barriers that can exist for women to access healthcare in general, and we can be that intermediate person to make sure that they're gaining that access, that they are familiar with the things that they should be doing to help take care of themselves and to get them on the right track. Again, sexuality, no surprise, women with disabilities want to have sex too. And so one of the videos that I've got posted for you guys to watch, this week's just a big TED Talk week, is from Dr. Danielle Shaypuck. I'm probably not pronouncing that in the right way. It's a nice little video. It's not very long. She's a woman with a disability herself. She kind of promotes herself as the Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City, but in the disability world of it, so somebody that has a disability but really talks about sex and promotes sex education and is openly discussing dating and body image of women with disabilities. And she also wears like fabulous shoes. So it's a really interesting video, but one of the things to remember is that when we, again, society as a whole, collectively, when we think of people with disabilities, we oftentimes have these biases, these inherent biases, or these stereotypes, these negative stereotypes where people with disabilities aren't well enough to have sex, aren't competent enough to have sex, don't find it to be something that's important, and all of those things are untrue. So while the needs and desires are the same across the board for individuals, women with disabilities and women without disabilities, we oftentimes are very hesitant to discuss these things with clients, and specifically with women with disabilities. So again, we might need to refer our clients out to a counselor or physician. This could come up if we are working down the road with couples and maybe the woman has a disability or has acquired a disability, and maybe we're then working with her to reframe her new self-image, her new self-concept, how she views herself and how she views her own sexuality. And so all of these things certainly can come up later down the road. When we think about motherhood, again, going even further back, there's been, that history of sterilization, and unfortunately a current practice of just providing or having women with disabilities, giving them long-term contraceptives without actually asking, or without providing any kind of explanation. And so there's still even a really large lack of understanding of how women with disabilities can even get pregnant, how they can carry a baby to term, and how they can care for a child afterwards. There are lots of different resources anymore online for women with disabilities who are mothers, who have blog posts and support groups for, how do I, I'm using a wheelchair. How do I transfer my baby from their crib? There's all different adaptive devices even. There are cribs that actually lower down that are still safe. So people that do use a wheelchair can access cribs, changing tables, things like that. Physical or occupational therapy may be helpful. So if you're working with a woman who has a disability, specifically a physical disability, who is pregnant or is having difficulty, caring for a child in some way, it may be appropriate to refer them out to somebody that can help them with kind of the mobility aspects that they may be having some difficulty with. So again, just being aware that motherhood is something that women with disabilities, both physical and mental disabilities, can certainly have a desire to achieve, and have the right to do that as well. Again, kind of getting into negative stuff, when we're looking at abuse and violence against people with disabilities, and specifically women with disabilities, there are various ways that we should be thinking about abuse. And so physical abuse is one way that a caregiver, or if somebody happens to be living in an institution of some sort or a long-term care facility, physical abuse is certainly something that still occurs, but emotional abuse as well is something that we need to be looking out for. And so if we're working with somebody, if we're working with a woman who has a disability that is reliant on caregiver services in some form or fashion, or is reliant on a family member, maybe even to help manage their medications or take them to doctor's appointments or things like that, we need to be aware for those little hints that they may be giving us that there's emotional abuse going on. For example, if we're working with a woman with, let's say, a mental health impairment, and they're saying that their significant other is telling them that if they don't clean the house, that they won't take them to see their psychiatrist for a medication refill. That's emotional abuse. We need to be aware of what to do whenever that occurs. So there's a high percentage of women with disabilities that report abuse, but there's a lot of different barriers to receiving assistance. Again, a lot of it has to do with access to services, access to facilities, general knowledge and understanding by these other service providers. And so, kind of circling back to the social justice part of it, this is where social justice and that concept comes into play, that we have the knowledge of how to help our clients get around those barriers, or to help our clients take the barriers down, eliminate them completely, right? By working with the other social service providers, working with local agencies, providing some psychoeducation around how to assist a woman with a disability if they are calling the police and need some help because they are experiencing violence in the home. We can provide that education to both our clients and our community as well. So with that, I will leave you guys to the rest of the module and the videos. There's also a podcast that I know I keep finding stuff that's from like Europe, but it is really interesting. So there's a podcast included in this week's module, which I haven't done the podcast thing yet, and I hope it works out pretty well for you guys. There's a lot of there's a transcript available too. So if you don't want to actually listen to it, but would prefer to read the transcript, that is available on the website as well. But the podcast is focused on Black disabled women in media. It's given by two individuals who founded kind of this group called Triple Cripples Project, which is their terminology, not mine. I would not use the C word personally, but it is their language, so that's what I put up there. And so it's highlighting the lack of representation in media of individuals with disabilities, which we know in general, although there's been slight improvements in that recently, but more specifically, women in media who have a disability who are Black. And so, I mean, me thinking right off the top of my head, I can't think of any representation of that specific subgroup of individuals with disabilities right now. And so that's saying something, right? Because there's a lot of media out there. So, I hope you find it interesting. The discussion this week is really just where you get to pick something that I put up there in the module, talk about it, give me your reaction to it, and hopefully a nice discussion will flow from that. And with the end of this module, you get a break. Yay! So, all right, talk to you all later.